Parks Victoria acknowledges traditional owners throughout Victoria and pays respect to their culture and elders past, present and future. This episode of Closer to Nature was recorded at Ricketts Point on Bunurong country and at Wilsons Promontory National Park. Wilsons Promontory is a highly significant living cultural landscape for the Gunai-Kurnai, Boonwurrung and Bunurong people. Parks Victoria respects the deep and continuing connection that traditional owners have to these lands and waters, and we recognise their ongoing role in caring for country.
When we sat down and Laura pointed the microphone in my direction, I realised that there was actually a little fluffy weed seed caught in the end of the mic. Not exactly sure what it is, gave the impression it's kind of some sort of fleabane species based on just the little seed head that it was, and that's just a prime example of how easy it is to unknowingly pick things up, whether it be on your shoes, on camping equipment, anything. If you've been out in an area and you've potentially come in contact with a weed species, it's so easy to just pick it up and take it somewhere else, and that's where hygiene is so important for people. So making sure that you're checking all of your gear, checking your shoes, checking your clothing, anywhere that you can potentially pick up seeds before you go to a new place, cleaning them off and making sure that you're not unknowingly spreading something to somewhere that it doesn't occur, which is exactly what's happened with the blue hound's tongue.
Ruby Wicks is a project coordinator for invasive species based at Wilsons Promontory National Park. Her job is to manage weeds and introduce pests like feral cats, rabbits and deer in the park, and trying to keep numbers as low as possible or even eradicate them completely. The blue hound's tongue weed she talks about is one that's only recently appeared on their radar.
We first found blue hound's tongue in March 2022. So it was actually discovered by contractors who were undertaking weed work in the Tidal River area, and they basically found this plant and said, oh, we've discovered this thing, we've never seen it before. We were quite surprised at how far it had gotten.
Welcome to Closer to Nature, a Parks Victoria podcast where we look at how climate change is impacting natural environments and species within our parks, and what we're doing to help. I'm Dr. Mark Norman, Chief Scientist, Conservation and Climate Action at Parks Victoria. Throughout this series I've been speaking to people to learn about the impact climate change is having on our parks. We've heard about big species like tall trees and some of our smallest creatures like the mountain pygmy possum and the bogong moth. We've also talked about the impacts and threats of climate change to Aboriginal cultural heritage and how volunteers are playing a key role in helping nature. I encourage you to go back and listen to those episodes if you haven't already. Today, we're going to talk about pest species, both on the land and in the ocean. But first, let's find out just what makes something a pest.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's like anything really can be a weed, as long as it's where it's not meant to be.
As we'll learn later on in the episode, even something that's native to Victoria can be a pest when it turns up in alarming numbers. Let's focus first on land weeds, with Ruby here in Wilsons Promontory at the southern tip of mainland Australia.
At the moment, we're in Tidal River in the campground at Wilsons Prom National Park, and we're tucked away in a nice little corner at a little picnic table, and there's a few weed species growing around us at the moment. So there's a little bit of fleabane and some asparagus fern and a couple of grasses, but it's not too bad in here. So at the prom, we've had over 200 different species of weeds in the park at one point or another, and the prom has quite a long history of having a lot of different land uses over time. So it really ranges from your kind of classic agricultural weeds from when there was stock grazing in the park, so things like ragwort, to your more generic species that just get transported from outside the park, like blackberries when birds and other critters eat them. And then we even have garden escapee species down here, so things that we know past residents a long time ago have planted in their home gardens down here, and they've made their way out of those boundaries and have kind of spread around. And then a lot of them, we don't even necessarily know where they've come from, like they just pop up So whether they're people bringing them in on camping gear and shoes and clothing. And then also just things like we're noticing a little bit at the moment, species that have come in off equipment. So things like slashing on roadsides. If equipment's not cleaned properly, then it can be brought into the park when works are undertaken. So it's a real mixed bag of how weeds are ending up down here.
Wilsons Promontory is like a huge island connected to mainland Australia by a narrow strip of land known as the Yannaki Isthmus. It sticks out into the cool waters of Bass Strait, facing the Southern Ocean and effectively Antarctica. So it's always cooler than the nearby mainland and makes it ideal as a climate refuge. The Prom is remote, but it's still not immune to weeds. These sneaky pests have many ways of turning up where they're not welcome. Birds can spread weeds flying between different locations. Other weeds might blow in on the wind. But the biggest culprit is humans. More than 500,000 people visit Wilsons Promontory every year.
It's a bit of a challenging one. Obviously, we have a lot of visitors who come through the Prom, and trying to get that information out to everyone can be quite challenging. So a lot of the time for us, it's more of a focus on, so Tidal River, where we are now where the campground is, we can have a few thousand people staying here in accommodation and camping at any one time. And so we tend to focus our efforts on those kind of hotspots. So it's where people are really congregating or there's a lot of disturbance that those weed species are going to pop up at first. So by focusing our efforts on those areas, we can hopefully catch things before they become too much of an issue.
A recent unwelcome discovery is the blue hound's tongue, a pretty but highly invasive and dangerous agricultural weed. And it started appearing in a campground at the Prom.
We're never going to know exactly for sure how it got here. So there's only a couple of occurrences of it elsewhere in Australia, which is in New South Wales around Eden. But otherwise it doesn't occur in Australia. However, it's native to Southern Europe and it's also naturalised in South America. So the most logical explanation that we can come up with is the presumption that someone somewhere in the world has picked up a seed of this plant on their hiking boots or their camping equipment or something of the like, and they've come down to the Prom and gone, oh, what's this sticky little burr stuck to my shoe? And they've flicked it off and blue hound's tongue has taken off from there.
Unfortunately, it took a while for the weed to be spotted. The first people to notice it were contractors who were doing weed control work in the area.
And from the research they'd done, they thought that it was potentially this new species, blue hound's tongue. And so we started looking into it and went, oh, hang on, this is potentially quite significant because there was no information about it occurring in Victoria, which was a bit stressful at the time, going, oh no, what have we actually got growing here? And then it was actually quite a long process. So it took basically 9 months to actually get confirmation that that was the plant that we thought it was.
Ruby and her team had to collect samples of the plant and send them to the herbarium at the Royal Botanic Gardens. But at that time of year, when they were collecting the samples, the plant wasn't flowering and no seeds could be collected for an absolute identification. Identifying plants to a species level can be tricky without the flowers or the seeds.
And so when we sent these little leafy samples to the herbarium, they said, doesn't look like a native species, but we need the flowers and the seeds to actually confirm that. So we had to wait, because it flowers over summer, we had to wait another 6 months until December to get those seeds and to get those flowers and send them off again. As soon as it started flowering, that first flowers, I think it was in October, we discovered the first plant that had a flower on it and we went, this is definitely blue hound's tongue. So it's really distinctive. It's got these beautiful little 5-petalled flowers that are kind of like a bluey pink colour, and they've got really distinctive dark blue veins across the petals. And we were able to send those off to the herbarium and finally get confirmation that this is what we thought it was. And then proper surveying and control kind of went from there. So it was a long process too, unfortunately. That's just the nature of these things.
Next, the team had to work out how it was spreading, which could help them identify any possible outbreak locations.
So, because it is covered in these sticky little burrs, it's really easy for people to get it, again, stuck to their shoes or their clothing or their camping equipment. Or we have a lot of wallabies and wombats, which are obviously very furry creatures. And when these seed pods, they're basically covered in little Velcro-like hooks, and the plants kind of only grow up to half to a metre in height. So they are just prime height for those furry critters to just pick it up. And then they travel around as they're feeding and doing their own thing, and then they'll scratch them off and drop the seed, and the plants can then just continue on from there.
They realised one of the biggest spreading culprits was the much-loved resident at the prom, the wombats. And they're very much at home at Tidal River. Thousands call the prom home.
So the prom is full of wombats, prombats as they're often referred to. They're notoriously cute because they just have big fluffy faces, and they just trundle around on their little legs, just snacking on anything that they can get pretty much. When we first started really properly surveying for the blue hound's tongue, what we realised was we kept finding it in locations where wombats love. So out the front of their burrows all around camps.
Wombats are covered in fluffy, dense fur. When they walk past weeds, the sticky seeds get stuck and hitch a ride on the wombat until the wombat stops to have a scratch near its burrow or roll around, then dislodging the seeds.
And one of the key pieces of advice that we were given from a colleague at DECA, Kate, who is part of the Weeds at the early stages of invasion team, she said, right, it sounds like these wombats are really your prime number one spreader. So the key is you've got to think like a wombat. And this is kind of this little mantra that we've carried around when we're doing this survey work is you've got to think, right, if I was the height of a wombat, where is the easiest path for me to follow? Where am I going to go? Where am I going to dig my burrow? And trying to put yourself in the wombat's shoes, basically, to think about how they're moving through this landscape. And by doing that, we're getting a better idea of where we might be finding these weeds and where they're going to be growing and how it's going to be spreading around the campground, basically. So there's been a lot of commando crawling and sticks stuck in hair and just getting a really good feel of those kind of unseen areas of Tidal River just through the nature of trying to figure out where these plants are and where these wombats are going. And it's quite impressive how much the wombats do get around, actually. They don't mess about. They are everywhere.
We often hear about the well-known threats like cane toads or more recently fire ants. But blue hound's tongue is really significant at a national level. The greatest concern for Ruby and her team is to contain this weed, to stop it spreading across the prom and further afield.
The impact is for agricultural purposes. So blue hound's tongue is toxic to livestock. So particularly in South Gippsland, we're very much dairy country down here.
So they had to make sure it was contained.
It's a 54,000 hectare park. So the areas where we do know that species occurring or infestations are and different types of weeds, there's species that we are getting on top of, and there's other species that are kind of generally more widespread anyway. So it's all about how we prioritise what we're treating and where we're treating. So we've got conservation action plans for the park, we've got a threat management strategy, we've got restoration plans, and all of those things kind of define what priority sort of species are in order of preference, and then we're talking about with those priority habitats. So we kind of go off ecological communities. So the Tidal River Campground technically is a coastal banksia woodland, which is a rare EVC. And so that means that if you can restore this sort of habitat, then there are really good values in these spaces.
When Ruby talks about EVCs, that's the acronym for Ecological Vegetation Classes. So these are different types of habitats and their dominant features. Examples would be things like coastal heathlands, cool temperate rainforest, or seagrass meadows.
And so that's where our priority kind of is, to make sure that we're treating zones where things aren't too bad. So the whole premise really of weed work is you start where things are good and you work into where things aren't so good. Overall, over the last few years, through the work that's gone on through Prom Sanctuary and protecting biodiversity, we've had a really big focus on the weeds in the park the last few years, which has been awesome that we're able to go back each year and actually recurrently treat some of these places and species as well. So it's not so ad hoc, and it gives us a good sort of coverage as well.
While Ruby and her team are battling invasive species on land at the Prom, Michael Sams and his team in the Marine and Coastal Sciences Unit are battling another, but this time underwater.
We're here at Ricketts Point Marine Sanctuary. So off the beach here is one of the, I think it's the second largest marine sanctuary that we have in Port Phillip Bay. You can't actually see a lot of what it is because it's under the waves, but under the waves beneath there we've got a really amazing marine ecosystem that's protected by this marine sanctuary. So it's got about 70% of it is rocky reef that should be covered in really diverse seaweeds and macroalgae and things we call sponge gardens. So communities that are made up of animals that live attached to the rock. It's full of fish. Then we've also got seagrass beds and these kind of sandy plains that are off under the water in the marine sanctuary there.
These underwater sanctuaries are under attack from a native species that's behaving badly. It's a case of when good animals go zombie or rogue. Sometimes a native species population can be too big and they start to damage their habitat, threaten other animals, even be a threat to their own survival.
So sea urchins have become a significant pest species, I would say, across most of eastern Victoria and here in Port Phillip Bay.
Sea urchins are the spiky round relatives of sea stars, a bit like the echidnas of the sea, but smaller. They live on rocky reefs and in seagrass meadows, protected from their attackers by their long, sharp spines. They have a special 5-toothed jaw underneath their body that's really good at eating seaweeds, even entire kelp forests.
But what we've seen in recent decades is a real expansion and explosion in their numbers. So they've now become what we call overabundant. So there are too many of them. And the result of that overabundance is that they're really over-consuming the things that they like to eat, which are seaweeds, or we call them macroalgae, and kelp are the larger canopy-forming species in particular.
Before we go any further, what is kelp?
The scientific definition of kelp is they are large seaweeds that are actually in one family called the laminarians. We tend to use that a bit more loosely. So when we tend to refer to kelp, we're really talking about the large canopy-forming brown seaweeds.
Kelp is the core component of these key underwater ecosystems. If they disappear, so too will many other species.
They are the tall species, so they give the reef a really complex three-dimensional structure, which means that they're really important habitat for heaps and heaps of species that live in amongst them. So things like little sea slugs, abalone like living under there. Southern rock lobster love to live in rocks and ledges and crevices that are near these species. And then there's a lot of herbivorous species, particularly herbivorous fish and things like that, which they're an important food source for. In addition to that, they have other kind of broader ecosystem benefits. So they're a plant, so they convert carbon dioxide in the water into oxygen. In areas like where we're standing here on the beach, they're really important for doing things like absorbing wave energy. So, as currents and wave energy move through them, they absorb a lot of that. So they offer a lot of protection to the reef, a lot of shelter. And that shelter is also really important for a lot of species that can live in there. And there are some other benefits too. So they're also known to be, carbon sinks. So they help take some carbon out of the water. And then when they die and they disappear into the kind of detritus of the ocean, they take some of the carbon away with them.
The disappearance of kelp from our oceans would be devastating. It'd be the same as every tree being cut down. There are 2 sea urchin species going rogue in Victoria. The first, the long-spined sea urchins, are marching around the corner from New South Wales.
And that's one that's really a range-extending species. So we found it in eastern Victoria, but eastern Victoria is a global sea surface temperature warming hotspot. And so we've seen a big expansion and range extension of that species into eastern Victoria. It's also jumped across to Tasmania as well, and causing significant problems and large barren areas created there.
This southward march is a direct impact of climate change. Waters that were once too cold for the New South Wales species to breed or survive in are now warm enough to invade. The second urchin causing problems is the local purple urchin. This species is native to southeast Australia and it's causing big problems in Port Phillip Bay.
The purple urchin has always been here in Port Phillip Bay, a really important part of the ecosystem, but over the last 20 to 30 years we've seen a huge increase in their numbers. They just graze on whatever they come across or they seek out with their mouths that are kind of close to the surface. You know, once they've eaten all the nice stuff like the macroalgae and the kelp, they'll start feeding on algal films on rock, and they can scrape lots of things off, and and depending on the species, some of them will consume just about anything that's soft enough for them to get their teeth around.
Over the last 20 to 30 years, populations of the purple urchin have dramatically increased.
And once those numbers have increased, they're just not coming back down. In most places, it's actually not causing a problem, but in Port Phillip Bay in particular, for various reasons, its numbers have really exploded. It's hugely overabundant. We've got, millions of urchins in the bay that are over-consuming our reef ecosystems.
When this heavy grazing or overeating happens, it forms large areas of bare rock, looking like empty concrete car parks. They're formerly known as urchin barrens.
So urchin barrens have always been the natural part of the system, but they've been small and kind of stable and localised. But what we're really seeing is the wholesale removal. We've seen that in places like Tasmania, where they had forests of the giant kelp, which are now basically just, if you see the difference, it's like going to see a rainforest and then coming back to a moonscape. They're just voracious grazers. They remove huge areas of forest. They also eat the kind of what we call the sessile animals as well, so the sponges and the soft corals that are there. So you basically go from having an ecosystem that's really diverse with hundreds of species, and basically it's gone. These barren areas have become really extensive. So the last kind of big estimates we had in Port Phillip Bay, about 60% of the bay has been turned into urchin barrens.
The reason why this happens is not totally understood.
So one of the theories that during the 80s there were a lot of nutrients that were coming into the bay, and this led to a proliferation of one of the favourite food sources of these purple urchins, which is drift algae. And so they became really abundant, just lots of food for them around. What ended up happening is we went into a drought, and at the same time a lot of the nutrients coming into the bay declined and went down because a lot of it was coming from wastewater treatment plants. Technology and upgrades meant that a lot less of that nutrient was coming into the bay, so that we think led to a diminishing in their food source, but there were already lots of urchins in the bay. And so what effectively happened is that they started to mobilise and move around and seek out other food sources. And then it becomes one of those positive feedback cycles where we had lots of urchins, they're producing lots of babies, and so their populations continue to expand.
At the same time as this, Victorian waters were warming, and urchins generally prefer warmer waters. Add to this equation loss of the predators that would normally keep sea urchin numbers in check. Species like southern rock lobsters and fishes like blue-throat wrasses lost due to heavy fishing pressures.
There is evidence from other parts of the world that once you get a cycle of these urchins proliferating and become overabundant, even having healthy predator guilds sometimes can't be enough to kind of contain their numbers. So it's one potential cause. We're not 100% certain that that's the cause, but it's probably a contributing factor.
But loss is not inevitable.
We're still a long, long way from that. Like we've got lots of, even in Port Phillip Bay, if you go to southern Port Phillip Bay and Port Phillip Heads, there's a really almost pristine ecosystem that's relatively unimpacted there.
There are 3 marine sanctuaries in northern Port Phillip Bay: Point Cook, Jawbone and Ricketts Point, and each has been impacted by overabundant sea urchins.
So what we've seen at Point Cook, which was probably one of the first and hardest hit by this overabundant urchin problem, and similarly at Jawbone, is we lost extensive amounts of habitat there. So it really was converted, particularly in the case of Point Cook, into almost entire urchin barrens, and a lot of Jawbone was lost. Like some estimates at points in time was around 90%, 70 to 90% of that macroalgal forest was lost in parts of Jawbone. Ricketts Point is a interesting example because what we're seeing right now is the really active expansion of these urchins in Ricketts Point, but there's still a lot of really good habitat here that remains. So if you go snorkeling off where we are standing right now to Tea House Reef here in the shallower waters, you can still see great, really healthy macroalgal forests, tons of fish, great fish diversity out here, so you can see all those colourful fish that live in the macroalgae. But if you go a bit further out into the deeper waters, or if you head south down to a place called Table Rock, that's where we're starting to see really extensive urchin barrens, which have been there for a while now. And so from our perspective, why that's really important to manage is, I guess, one of the fundamental approaches in conservation is to protect what you have. It's so much harder to restore and bring back habitat once you've lost it. And we've still got great and really large expanses of habitat, which we've mapped in Ricketts Point, that we're trying to protect at the moment.
So action is being taken. The urchins can be controlled and the loss reversed.
And then we've been bringing in diving contractors there over the past 3 to 4 years. In some of those areas that we had urchin numbers reduced down pretty significantly around 2 years ago, we're seeing golden kelp basically coming back.
The diving contractors cull sea urchins and remove the heavy grazing pressure from these marine sanctuaries.
They just go in and split the urchin in half really quickly, so very quick, instant death for the urchin, and then they leave them in the park. So all of that, energy and biomass that's in those urchins stays in the park system.
Michael says they've also had a lot of help from community groups in the area who sounded the initial alarm about the growing urchin populations.
So the North Port Phillip team at Parks Victoria have worked really closely with Jawbone and the Marine Care Group at Ricketts Point. So a lot of the initial urchin management activities were done with the help of them as volunteers, and so that's a way some people can contribute. Those activities do need to be done with Parks Victoria and supervised by Parks Victoria, because we're talking about a native species in our park, so we can't really let people just get out there and remove urchins. There are also other urchin species out there that aren't problematic, so people need to make sure that they know what they're dealing with.
The local community has helped Michael and his team with their vast knowledge of the area.
Like, you have people down here at Ricketts Point in Marine Care Ricketts Point Group who've been living and snorkelling and diving at Ricketts Point for decades and know more about the place than anyone. And they were really instrumental in identifying these problems. Exactly the same with the Jawbone group. They were some of the ones who came to us initially and spoke to us and researchers and said, hey, there seems to be a problem going on here. And that intelligence is still really vital. So that's how we've learnt about where some of the really problematic areas are in Ricketts Point that we need to attack, and having those community eyes on the ground to be able to tell us, hey, this is problems popping up here again, is really valuable. Because as you can imagine, these are quite big parks, and Ricketts Point isn't a big park compared to what we have in the whole estate, but to try and dive and snorkel and see everything that's going on there is quite hard.
The work of protecting marine parks like Ricketts Point will be an ongoing task, but Michael and his team are confident they'll soon see the kelp and other seaweeds bounce back.
I've got a lot of hope, because what we've seen at Jawbone was just this really rapid recovery simply from removing urchins, and I'm expecting to see the same at Ricketts Point. The challenge for us is really just to keep the momentum going. So really hopeful actually that if we get these urchin numbers down, in a matter of years, we could have pretty intact kelp forests back in some of these areas. And we are monitoring, like through our science programs, all these actions, we're monitoring the recovery and how rapid that is.
Just like Ruby and her team at the Prom dealing with invasive species, Michael and his team will have to manage urchin numbers for the foreseeable future.
The urchin barons aren't just in the park, they're everywhere. The urchins don't care about an invisible boundary around a marine sanctuary. It means nothing to them. So one of the challenges is that if we do a really good job in our marine sanctuaries, we still have potential for them to move back in from outside.
At the same time, these marine sanctuaries can be critical refuges for the diversity of our native marine life. As we turn the climate crisis around, on whatever timescale that is, these marine protected areas will be key to conservation efforts. They will help seed and reseed the next generations of seaweeds, seagrasses, fishes, sea stars, corals, sponges, crabs, cuttlefish, and so much more.
So this is going to be an ongoing issue for us. Just like most of our pest management is on land, we're going to have to keep holding back the tide. But it does seem to be a really effective and simple way just to get in there. So it's just about continuing those management actions and putting the resources towards doing that.
Many others are also working to help fight the impacts of climate change on kelp forests. Parks Victoria is partnering with the University of Melbourne, the Nature Conservancy and Deakin University to develop a kelp seed bank. Samples are taken from kelp populations all across Victoria to give us a clear picture of all the kelp species across the state, their genetics and their climate tolerances. This knowledge becomes an insurance policy. If waters get too warm, More resilient kelp varieties could be brought to places like Ricketts Point Marine Sanctuary to make sure that kelp forests persist, which will also help other plants and animals that rely on them. Australia's isolation for millions of years means that plants and animals evolved in special ways. Most Australian species occur nowhere else on Earth. This brings risk as the native species are not well adapted to the many threats of introduced and invasive plants and animals. Climate change can further supercharge these threats, and as we've heard, can even make local species go zombie. Better understanding of our park's vulnerabilities to climate change is front of mind for park managers. Thanks for listening to Closer to Nature. I'm Mark Norman, and thanks to my guests, Dr. Michael Sams and Ruby Wicks, for sharing their knowledge with us. In our next episode, we'll hear about an incredible rescue mission that took place in the middle of the extreme Black Summer bushfires.
The helicopter flew very low and followed the coast. Everyone was just pretty much silent, just gazing at this devastation. It was a feeling of helplessness, and we were all fairly demoralised. It made us think we better really do our best here and try and give these birds in this perilous position the best possible chance of survival.
Closer to Nature is a Parks Victoria podcast. This episode was produced by Liz McKenzie, Ben Francischelli, Paddy Naughtin, and hosted by me, Dr. Mark Norman. Production and sound design by Laura Briley-Newton from Audiocraft, and production support from Olivia O'Flynn, also from Audiocraft. We'd love to know what you think, so please subscribe to Closer to Nature and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.